Get going. Welcome everybody to the March installment of EPSP Connects. Before we launch into this month's event, I want to plug next month's event. And on Wednesday, April 19th, we will have two presentations again on ecology and geomorphology of wildfire from Dr. Clark Knight, who is with the USGS, and from Dr. Karina Surovsky-Dariau, who is with the USGS and USAID. The event will also start at 8 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and we would love for you to join us if you are free. But for this month's event, we recognize that we are a community of researchers and educators that focus on surface processes. Many of us use topographic data as a key tool. And in the past several decades, there's been tremendous progress in technology, namely LiDAR, that allows us to obtain high-resolution topographic data sets and creates opportunities to interrogate topography as a signature of finer-scale processes. The USGS 3D elevation program is one of the largest sources of high-resolution topographic data and has already retrieved data for much of the conterminous US and is set to fill in the gaps. We thought it would be a good time to hear from folks that have been directly involved with the USGS 3D program and have used data in research contexts. So today we have two presentations from two people that have played roles in collecting, creating, and using USGS 3D data. We will first hear from Dr. Jason Stoker, who is a science lead for the USGS elevation program. And then at hour, Dr. Chelsea Scott will follow with a presentation on research applications of USGS 3D data. So we hope to reserve time for questions at the end of each presentation and then open up to more broadly oriented questions if possible. So throughout the presentation, feel free to enter questions into the chat and we will read them out later. We will first start with Dr. Jason Stoker. A little bio about him is Dr. Jason Stoker is the Elevation Science and Application Lead for the USGS National Geospatial Program at USGS headquarters. Jason oversees strategic planning, development, and coordination of the 3D elevation program and science application related data, tools, and services. Jason provides technical expertise, prepares roadmaps and plans for elevation products and services, and helps determine the long-term vision of 3D products and services. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jason Stoker. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. Let me get my screen sharing going. All right, we looking good? Okay, thumbs up. Yeah, Tyler, thanks for the opportunity here to talk about 3DEP. It's something I've been working on for a really long time, and I know in my interactions going around talking to people who actually have LiDAR and elevation needs, that a lot of times they don't realize the amount of things that we've set up that they can take advantage of. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with 3DEP, so I just wanted to do a real quick intro. So 3DEP is really a partnership program that we started officially back in about 2015. It was based on a study that we did that calculated costs and benefits of a national program, which really kind of set the stage for us to become operational. And the idea is, collecting LiDAR, especially airborne LiDAR, is pretty expensive. So the idea to collect a single data set that meets a lot of people's needs was really attractive. And so with that in mind, we set up this program that partners with state, local, nonprofits, even private sector folks to pool all our money together in order to get a large area LiDAR acquisition done. And our goal is to really have that kind of data available for the whole US in the time frame of less than a decade, but it's all based on funding, of course. As Tyler kind of mentioned in the intro here, this status map kind of shows you where we are since we started officially in 2015. We have about 90% of the country either with data available or in progress. So that's what all those green areas show there. It's a combination of both us working on the acquisitions ourselves and us partnering with other folks, usually state entities that manage the acquisitions and then provide the data to us. And I mentioned, in terms of our progress here, we think if if we are lucky and can get at least level funding for the next several years, we should have this entire map filled in with green in about 2026. I don't want to leave Alaska out of the mix. We have 100% of Alaska covered with 5-meter IFSAR, and that data is available for anybody to use right now. When I talk about 3DEP, especially the products that are available, it's really not just a single thing. It's the suite of products. We focus on the LiDAR acquisitions, but that also the LiDAR is used to create what we call source DEMs, which can be variable in both resolution and projections. And then we take that LiDAR data and we convert it into this 1-meter standard product, so that data is more standardized across the country. And then that feeds into what we used to call the National Elevation Data Set, which is seamless elevation data at these different resolutions, primarily the 1/3 arcsecond, which is about a 10-meter resolution, and a 30-meter data set, which is the 1 arcsecond. So there's a wide range of products that we make available, and they usually are pretty much interconnected in terms of the source data that fed into creating those downstream products. Something that we refer to a lot when we're talking about 3DEP data is this concept of quality levels. So we developed this specification that if anybody who wants to collect LiDAR to go into the 3DEP repository has to meet all the letters of the specification. And this concept of quality levels really helps us kind of design both the accuracy and the resolution of the source and derived product data. So we have a goal for 3DEP to have the data be at least QL2 or better, which that equates to at least 2 pulses per square meter, 2 points per square meter, with a RMSE compared to surveyed checkpoints in flat open areas of about 10 centimeters. And that's really key because we actually pay certified land surveyors to go out as part of these projects and verify the accuracy of this data. So that's something that's probably a little different than a lot of the scientific LiDAR data sets that a lot of you are used to. Just wanted to drop some notable statistics here in case you weren't aware. We have a lot of data in the 3DEP repository now. It's almost 52 trillion points that are available. And as I mentioned, it's a partnership project, so we're not a systematic national mapping program. We collect these data in discrete projects, and we have over 1,900 projects available. It's about 300 terabytes of data that we have available right now in LAZ format. We don't really talk about download metrics so much anymore. You'll see why in a little bit, but in FY22 there was over 1,300 terabytes downloaded just from our local servers, and on S3 we had over 1 million hits and almost 50 terabytes of data pulled down from Amazon. I mentioned, this data is all over the board. So the original source data is at least 37 different coordinate reference systems. There were 79 different generating software packages that we recorded available for this data. The median point density, so I mentioned the quality level 2 thing of at least 2 points per square meter. When you actually dig into the data, you'll see that the point densities are almost usually 2x that. So there's at least around 4 points per square meter on median per project here, and around 2 points per square meter for ground points. And even though we require the data to be collected at that QL2 level, what we found is that the contractors actually collect the data at a little bit higher resolution to make sure that they're hitting those targets. We compared on a national-wide basis that old NED data set in 2013 to some NGS Opus points, and the RMSEs were about 1.5 meters. And then this paper that I've got here, we kind of revisited that accuracy assessment. We've pretty much cut that RMSE in half, mostly because we've been feeding in all these high-resolution LiDAR data sets into that 10-meter seamless that I mentioned. And we think that, once we have that entire map green and all that data is available and we process it to our 1/3 arcsecond seamless, the overall RMSE in flat open areas should be around 35 centimeters. And then for these individual projects, it should be about 13 centimeters compass wide. So now I'm going to kind of get into the data access piece, and it's a blessing and a curse for 3DEP because our data is used for so many different applications by so many different people. It's nice to have that wide user base, but it also means that we have to cater to a lot of disparate people's requirements. Everyone from the casual user who doesn't even know what LiDAR is, doesn't care. Maybe they just want to know, how steep is this hiking trail that I want to go on, for my round trip hike, all the way up to people I lovingly refer to as the DIY experts. That's probably a lot of folks in this group, where no matter what application or tool we build, it will never satisfy their needs. In fact, a lot of them get publication credits by showing that the status quo that we're building is garbage. So they build a lot of things, and we want to be able to support that. And we've set up these different kinds of access methods to kind of on both the raster and point cloud side to satisfy a lot of these requirements. I'm not going to go into depth here on each of these individual pieces, but just to kind of show that we're aware of the wide ranges of uses, and we've been trying to enable this multi-level of expertise access to our data, so hopefully people can extract the value out of it that they need, depending on their level of expertise. I often joke about 3DEP, and maybe it's USGS in general, but more specifically, the National Geospatial Program that I work on. It's kind of like a speakeasy. We've got this amazing, cool stuff that's out there. A lot of times there's things that have been built, but in order to know, you have to know what alley to go down, and you have to know the secret knock to get into the door before you can have that experience. And so we've been working on, how do we improve this part? And instead of, trying to build all these tools that satisfy everyone's needs, like I mentioned, we've been focusing on making the access and the provisioning of the data our most important piece. And so, one of the things that we've noticed is as we've worked hard to just provision this data and make it as easily accessible as possible, we've had this kind of explosion of applications and tools of people that are tapping into this data and doing way more with it than we ever could. And Chelsea's going to talk about a really great example that Open Topography has. But just a lot of these things that we're showing, and a lot of these innovations, like creating stat catalogs, for example, building streaming point clouds, none of these things would have been possible by 3DEP alone. It took outside people to see these resources and generate value added to it, and make the access and tools better than anything we could have done. Our primary way that USGS makes the data available is via this LiDAR Explorer app. You can see the link there. It's kind of our distilled version of the national map. So it's, what do you want? Do you want LiDAR? Do you want DMs? Here's where they are. Click on a project. We'll give you all the information about it. You can either download what you need, draw a box. You can download the entire project. You can go to our links to do batch downloads. Or in many cases, you can just visualize that data in 3 dimensions. So LiDAR Explorer, if you haven't heard of it, is a really good resource to go out and you can see what data we have available. We have a lot of data that's inherent in our repository that's not just that QL2 or better data. We have a lot of legacy stuff, for example, that I actually basically dug out of the dumpster. People just cared about the bare DMs and didn't care about the point cloud data, and we were able to save that and preserve it. There's obviously, before 3DEP was established and we had this specification, a lot of these data sets, especially the point clouds, weren't necessarily QA'd as robustly as we do. So there's a lot of warts in some of that older data. But we do make that available, especially for people who may want to start looking at time series things like I think Chelsea's going to talk about later. We do provide some limited processing. So we have this cloud-based processing system where you can go to a project, draw a box, change some of the parameters of the data. So if you wanted to change the projection, you wanted to filter by different returns, different classifications, you wanted to save it as a different format, maybe even interpolate it from a point cloud into a raster. We have these capabilities. You can either do some of the processing directly in the cloud. We have a limited budget to set up to do some of that processing on the fly for people, as well as the PDAL pipelines. So the actual scripts that we use to do those conversions, we make those available. So you may not want to necessarily process the data now or on that resource, but you can save that pipeline and use it however you'd like. And really the explosion of all of this stuff, I think, in my opinion, really came to when Amazon let 3-depth LiDAR point cloud data become a public data set. So his name Howard Butler had developed this entwined point tile format. He converted all of our LAZ data into this EPT format, and working with Amazon has made that available as a public data set. And once that application was kind of out in the wild, that's when we started seeing, this really big growth in access to our data. As I mentioned, we also store the data, as LAZ in Amazon S3 in a requester pays bucket if you're not necessarily wanting to work with EPT. We also make it completely freely available on our on-premise hardware. It's a lot slower, but it is actually free. If you do just want to download the data, we still provide that option. And Howard built this really nice interface for us here for 3D visualization, so you can see the different little pieces of patches that we have for these different projects for the US in one place. You can go look at each individual project, and you can just click on one of these links below, and then you can visualize the data in 3 dimensions via your browser. So we have two options right now, 2 different types of viewers, which have a little bit different capabilities. But the idea is, now you can start looking and interacting with the point cloud data before you even think about downloading it. So you can go to these viewers, you can look at the projects, you can filter, you can change how the data is being represented, and you can look at it, you can mess around with it without having to download any of the data to your local machine. You can still do that after the fact, but this is a really nice way to get kind of a 3-dimensional preview even of what the data is before you start digging into it. And when we started looking at the way this EPT data was set up, we could finally stop looking at data on a project by project basis, which is what we had focused on, and start looking at the aggregation of all of these data sets together, all these projects together. And it really opened our eyes into some of the things that we hadn't really thought about. So for example, here, this is the entire state of Kentucky represented in your browser. Colored by intensity images. And what you see here is that, looking at the normalized range of each of these projects by intensity, there's a lot of variation there. It was something that when we were contracting on a project by project basis, we never really thought about putting limits or bounds to make that variable more consistent across all of our projects. So being able to view like entire states worth of data has been really key for us for applications. This is another example. So someone had a question, are there gaps between a few projects in New Mexico? So we were able to, without downloading all the data, bring in all of these projects into our viewer and look and see if these were actual gaps within projects. And if they were, then we have to make the decision, do we go out and fill in those gaps, or how do we deal with them? Also bring this EPT data now into QGIS. It's a really cool thing that they've developed in the past couple of years. So you take one of those JSON links that was on that earlier page, and you can paste that into the point cloud type in some of the newer versions of QGIS. And in this case, I brought in 4 different projects in North Carolina. So you can look at billions and billions of points in QGIS and use that in ways to help inform some of your decisions and bring in other data as well. In this case, I zoomed in here, and I also brought in our dynamic elevation service, which I'll mention in a minute. I think that some of the newer versions of QGIS are also going to actually have point cloud processing capabilities. So I think that's going to be really exciting, where you can bring in these entire projects into your QGIS environment and do point cloud processing on it without having to download all that data at one time. On the raster side, we've built something called the dynamic elevation service. It's a web coverage service. And so we've taken all these rasters that we have, put them together in a mosaic data set. We put the highest resolution or the newest data on top. So what you see is what we call our best available data. And because it's a WCS, it's really cool. Every pixel in that service has an actual elevation value. So it's not just a picture of the data, it's the actual data itself. And you can bring this WCS into a lot of different GIS software packages. I'll show a couple examples, but what this really enables is bringing in this data and doing processing on it without having to necessarily download it all to your local machine first. If you just Google 3D dynamic elevation service, you should come to this technical announcement page we have. And this REST endpoint here is what you would plug into a lot of your GIS systems and add that as a layer into your software. We built this demonstration application viewer, so you can just go to that link there at the bottom. And for the whole US where we have data, you can on the fly zoom around, pan around, and generate these derivatives. So for example, we've got some different flavors of hill shades. It calculates slope from the data, aspect from the data, another hill shade. You can make contours on the fly. You can even do some basic querying, like draw a path and get the elevation profile of the data across that path, all without downloading any of the data. So you don't have to mess with that to get some of that information. You can, like I mentioned, you can add that WCS into like ArcGIS here. So I'm showing ArcPro. You add that REST endpoint. The default here, and this is one of those speakeasy things. So the default here, it defaults to hill shade. So if you go in, right click and select the none processing template, then you have access to all the elevation data. And so then you can start using the elevation data and derive all these kinds of products, use them in all the geoprocessing tools that are available. Just another example there. And then one of the things that was cool was colleagues at NOAA needed access to our 1/3 arcsecond seamless data in a different format. And so instead of us having to develop this, they built this virtual raster tiles tables index of our seamless data. And so what's really cool is once they built that for themselves, they taught us how to build it, I should say. We made it available, and now this is a capability that you can get. So you can take that 1/3 arcsecond seamless data that we have, and you can bring the entire thing in. And what's really cool about this is, so now you can start doing customized things with the VRT that you, before you would have had to take all those tiles, mosaic them together on your computer and then do stuff with it. So like for this example here, I brought in the entire VRT into QGIS. It takes a long time to do something like this. I think it took like 20 minutes to load up the whole United States at 10 meters streaming through that VRT. So if you really wanted to just process the data, you know what you wanted to do using some command line code like GDAL, which is what's running in the back end of this clipping tool I'm going to show. So we wanted to get a 10-meter DM of the entire state of Idaho. In the past, in order to do that, we would have had to select all those tiles, download them all down, mosaic them together, clip them out by the polygon. But with this VRT process, we can just bring in the VRT, bring in the shape that we wanted to clip, and then clip out that entire 1/3 arcsecond and have that mosaic of the entire state. And I know it's hard to read this eye chart here, but for me, it took about 26 minutes to do all of that. So, you know, it's a big improvement from the past ways we had to do things. So I mentioned there's a ton of applications that are out there. I'll leave Chelsea to talk about all the cool things Open Topography does, but I do want to highlight that making this data accessible allowed Open Topography to tap into it and apply all the cool tools and algorithms that they have developed that we never probably would ever have the budget to do. And so now users can take advantage of 3Dep data in other portals like Open Topography. Another example, NGA has a similar system called Grid. By making our data available in the ways we've done, now all the tools that are available in the Grid system, that they have some customized functionalities. You can take advantage of those. Google Earth Engine has taken and gotten a copy of our bare DMs, primarily our 1 meter and our 1/3 arc second. So if you're working in Google Earth Engine, you can now tap into that high resolution data that we've been making available for 3Dep and use it. And then I think finally here, Planetary Computer, Microsoft's Planetary Computer has also taken a copy of our data and added value to it. And in this case, they've converted all the data to this new point cloud format called Cloud Optimized Point Cloud, or COPSI. And then they've also spun off these automated derivative products that we never at USGS would have necessarily had the bandwidth to do. One of my favorites is the height above ground product that they've created, where now instead of just looking at the elevation data, they've done normalized differencing of the bare ground. And now you can go straight into the Planetary Computer and start working with the height above ground data without having to do that pre-processing step to create it. And so I think, you know, we're just at the tip of the iceberg of what's possible, but I'm really excited to see. And I just wanted to mention, you know, for you all, if you are using 3Dep data, it's really important for you to share with us how you're using it and what an impact it's making, you know, because there's no guarantee that this program or this data is going to be around forever. We can't justify our success by just showing usage anymore of gigabytes downloaded versus what we're putting out there. With so many versions and copies of the data available, it's impossible to really track the impact and use of the data the way we used to. So these stories or applications are really important. And I wanted to end there to just highlight that we really need to know these, because this shows the value of the data and the value of making this data publicly available to the folks that fund us to continue operating. And so I'll stop there, Tyler. I don't know if I went too long for questions or not.
No, that's perfect. If anybody has any questions, well, thank you, Jason. And if anybody has any questions, please write them in the chat. And we'll take a couple of minutes here, I think, to respond to those.
Can I ask a question just verbally or
Sure.
orally? I mean, so this is I mean, it's kind of overwhelming, like all the possibilities out there. Like, is there someone like you were talking about access and stuff? Like, what would be the, I don't know, the route to go? Like me, like as a scientist, and I have a project. Like, are there people to consult? Like, are there consultants like to consult about the best direction to go, the best data to use, and how to use it?
I know they're not in the academic perspective, but there are commercial companies that have based their entire business model on doing those things for people, just being able to have access to our data and providing services. There are companies that have been popping up all over the place that are using our data. Usually our data in combination with, you know, imagery, for example, to make, you know, classifications, routines, things like that. Personally, I'm more than happy. If you have random questions, you can always come to me. I'm more than happy to be the first point on that. We do have a help desk line for like technical questions with issues with the data. For example, if you find a mistake or a problem, we have a help desk for that. But, it's so, there's no one right answer, I guess, is the question, or, the answer to your question. There's no one right way to do things. But we do have a lot of experience that we could offer suggestions how to ideally do it. And a lot of times it's not just can you do it, but can you afford to do it too? Because a lot of these things that people want to do now are at scale. And in order to do that, you need to be in the cloud and you need to be able to pay for, compute and storage of the results. And so there's a lot of things like that to think about as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jason.
I think that we will probably return to some questions later, but for the moment, let's move on to Dr. Chelsea Scott. Chelsea Scott is an assistant research professor at Arizona State University and a member of the Open Topography leadership team. She has extensive background in using remote sensing techniques such as LiDAR, UAVs, and INSAR to study earthquakes and geomorphology. At Open Topography, she has led different topographic differencing, community outreach, and sustainability activities. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Chelsea Scott.
Thank you for the invitation to speak here today, Tyler. Today I'm going to talk about a project done by the Open Topography team, and we recently completed LiDAR topographic differencing of the full state of Indiana. So in this presentation today, I will discuss what is open topography, that provided the context for completing this project. The majority of the presentation will then focus on topographic differencing applied to Indiana. Specifically, I'll discuss motivation, workflow, show multiple examples of the differencing work, discuss noise and visualization, and then I'll discuss some potential activities looking forward. And this figure here on the right looks at vertical topographic change along a river, and is figures that I'll show throughout the presentation today. Blue represents downward movement of the Earth's surface, red represents upward, and in this case, blue is often erosion along this river, and then red is either deposition and or change in the vegetation along this farm. So as I said, this project was completed by Open Topography, and we are an NSF-funded facility that democratizes access to high-resolution topography and processing tools. Our team is shown here. The leadership team is Vishu Nandagam, Chris Crosby, Ramon Aerosmith, and me. And the full team completed this project. We are located at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, Arizona State University, and EarthScope. And all the processing that I'll show you today was completed at the San Diego Supercomputer Center using their supercomputer resources. So in more detail, Open Topography provides data hosting and distribution. So anyone can easily access many high-resolution topography as well as global data sets. In the past few years, we've added access to USGS 3DEP and very recently to NOAA data sets. And at present, this access is limited to academics and educators. And with all of these tools, we've co-located on-demand processing. And so with just a few clicks of your mouse, you can come on to Open Topography and create a digital elevation model, visualization products, hill shades, canopy height models, hydrology tools, and differencing products. And essentially with these tools sitting on your laptop, you can access very easily supercomputer power. We also do a variety of education and training activities. We attend many national conferences and present how to use open topography there. Later today, we have a weekly webinar series that we are starting. And online, we also have a variety of training activities that you're welcome to access. And so last year, we completed this big data project looking at statewide topographic differencing of the full state of Indiana. And this project is published last year in the Journal of Remote Sensing. It's an open access publication, and I invite you to check it out to learn more details about what we've done. So what are the motivations for this project? As an NSF data facility, we were interested in figuring out how to do large-scale processing of topography data. And from a science side, we were interested in understanding what a decade of change looks like across an entire state. Many people have asked, well, why did you pick Indiana? There's three main reasons. The state has two statewide high-resolution topography data sets that were acquired about a decade apart, and this is an appropriate timescale for such a project. Second, we anticipated a lot of interesting change over the state due to the varied land use across the state, from urban areas, farming, fluvial landscapes, forests, and then as shown here, coastal processes along the Indiana Dunes National Park. And finally, open topography has been in about a decade-long hosting partnership with the state of Indiana, and we were interested in further developing that collaboration. There are many challenges that we hit and overcame throughout the project. The first is we had to deal with big data. So Indiana is 2 to 3 orders of magnitude larger in area than the area of even past large differencing studies. And then the theme of big data, we had to overcome several computational challenges. So we had to develop an essentially completely automatic workflow that would take advantage and work with the high performance computing resources at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. We had to deal with memory needs, particularly for the intermediate calculations. And then the final products are about 4 terabytes in size. So we had to develop a methodology to both store and be able to access that data efficiently. And then we're also interested in looking at the noise sources at this statewide scale and thinking about if we should correct them and how they may affect the interpretation of our results. And then finally, we're interested in what's the best way to visualize the results. In particular, how can we make it easy for the broad community to take advantage of our research and see the change throughout Indiana. So I'll now discuss the methodology for the topographic differencing. In this particular case, we did vertical topographic differencing. And so the first step generally for topographic differencing is to take the point cloud data and produce an identical grid for the pre and post event or first and second sets of topography data. So here in the top left, that shows the pre or compare or first point cloud data set shown in blue. And then we grid that point cloud data set, which is shown here. The second data set can be called the reference or post. And here the point cloud is shown in pink. And then we grid that pink point cloud into the identical grid as the first data set. As you can see here, there's a lot more pink points than there are blue points. And a common theme is that over time, the quality of LiDAR data increases. And so the later data set often has a higher resolution as well as a higher point density. I'll talk about this later and how it affects our project. Next step in the differencing is a raster subtraction. So this is where we calculate the difference or the vertical change by taking the reference data set and subtracting the compare. And in this figure here, as in all the vertical change maps I show, the red represents downward motion of the Earth's surface and blue represents upward motion. And if you're interested in learning more about vertical topographic change generally, I invite you to check out our paper from about 2 years ago. We reviewed differencing methods in context of the on-demand differencing available in open topography. So here's the workflow that we developed for the differencing for the full state of Indiana. We did this approach county-wide for the 92 counties of Indiana that together make up about 94,000 square kilometers. And the data sets were collected, the first one in 2011 to 2013, and then the second one in 2016 to 2020. So the first step was to access the data. We downloaded the data from Amazon Web Services and sent that data to the San Diego Supercomputer Center. Next step in the processing was to divide the topography data sets into tiles, to then extract ground points based on the original point classification, to transform the coordinate reference system so that both data sets had the same coordinate systems, and then to generate the digital elevation models. The next step was differencing. So we produced differenced digital surface models, differenced digital terrain models, as well as canopy height models. And then the final step was to produce a visualization. So this is a web mapping service that makes it easy to visualize the results. This is looking at the statewide results for the topographic differencing. On the left shows the differenced digital terrain model. So this has the effect of the vegetation and buildings removed. And then on the right is the differenced digital surface model. So there's a variety of signals of change that can be seen at this statewide scale. In particular, in the digital surface model, some of the very prominent signals represent fluvial and riparian zones. For example, you can see here the Wabash River goes through Indiana, as well as the White River. There's also quite prominent signals from vegetation. For example, you can see this boundary here from purple to red, and these boundaries represent different seasons of data set acquisition. There's a variety of signals from quarries and mining, particularly in the western and southern portions of the state. And then, especially in the digital terrain model, a very prominent signal is from these flight alignment errors. And these create these north-south and east-west errors throughout the data set. And you can browse the results from this project at this link here, portal.opentopography.org/Indiana. So now go through some examples of the topographic differencing results. Throughout Indiana, you can see examples of new construction. This top plot here shows this example of this new development. And all of these figures, the left is the earliest data set, the middle is the later topography data set, and then the right is the topographic differencing. And in this case, or for all the data, the blue represents increased elevation. And so we see all of these new houses that were constructed between the acquisitions of the two LiDAR data sets. And this bottom example shows the development of this cloverleaf highway in northern Indianapolis. In particular, we see the development of this new part of the highway, as well as some bending of the highway approaching that new cloverleaf intersection. You can also see fluvial processes throughout the state of Indiana. This is looking at the river in the very southwestern portion of the state. And again, here we see erosion in red, deposition in blue. And this is an interesting case where these flight alignment errors here that create these north-south stripes do actually make it harder to interpret both the sign and the magnitude of the deformation signal. It's an example of a limestone quarry where the dominant color of red in the scene represents the removal of material, which is consistent with what should be happening during mining or quarrying process. So this set shows sinkholes. So these sinkholes create this pimpled landscape pattern over different parts of the state of Indiana. And topographic differencing can show how these sinkholes change over time. So in this case, the blue circles represent sinkholes that were filled in between the two data acquisitions. And then the red represents sinkholes that formed between the two data acquisitions. This shows the construction of the stadium at the Indiana University. So here are the two topography data sets. And in this case, this part here, which is the Student Success Center, was the new construction part of the stadium. And what's really interesting about this is here, the most southern part of the stadium, you can see this crane. And it's very nicely displayed in the topographic hillshade. And it's even shown in the vertical change map where it represents temporary increase in elevation. So as I said earlier, one of the prominent sources of noise are these flight alignment errors. They're particularly shown here in the digital terrain model. And they create these north-south and east-west oriented stripes in the differencing results. And very likely this source of noise reflects the earlier data acquisition from 2011 to 2013. And that is because the boundaries of the dataset boundaries or the dataset acquisitions are aligned with the change in orientation of these stripes. Now, these sources of noise can be corrected with flight trajectory information. However, this process is very time intensive, even for a small study area. So we chose to not correct this source of noise for three main reasons. One, it's very time intensive, but more importantly, the majority of the change signals that we see throughout the state are larger than the error from these flight alignment errors. And then second, provides an opportunity, not correcting them provides an opportunity to understand the overall data set quality and the suitability for these large scale studies. So we developed this web map service that can be used to visualize the change throughout Indiana. So right now you can go to portal.opentopography.org/Indiana and explore the change map. And so at this large scale, you can look at the digital terrain models, digital surface models, the difference maps, and the canopy height models. And this video is showing it in real time. And so you can see that as you zoom in, it takes only a few seconds for the new data to load at its original or as high resolution. So now we're zooming into a part of the western suburbs of Indianapolis, and we're going to look at these new warehouses you can see, as well as a new suburban development. And here we're looking at the DSM difference. And so these new buildings are shown here in blue. Very quickly, we can then also look at the other products that we created. For example, the 2 digital surface models. And again, it's very efficient with this tool to zoom in and look at the process data at a higher resolution. So we're looking here at these new developments shown in blue on the digital surface model change map. So looking forward, over a third of the lower 48 are now covered by repeat LiDAR topography. This provides an enormous opportunity to characterize anthropogenic change to both the natural and anthropogenic landscapes. This has a variety of applications, for example, looking at biomass change, coastal change, hazards such as flooding, landslides, and sinkholes, and then urban development. However, one of the challenges is that it's becoming prohibitively time intensive to manually analyze these large data sets, and this motivates developing approaches like machine learning. So in conclusion today, the Open Topography team has conducted statewide topographic differencing of the full state of Indiana. We overcame a variety of challenges to develop this automated workflow applied to big LiDAR data. And as the publicly available topography dataset collection grows, increasingly more areas will be covered by single and repeat topography data. And these large-scale analyses provide an important opportunity to characterize the Earth's landscape and its changes over time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Chelsea. That was excellent. If you have questions for Chelsea, please put them into the chat. I see that we have a couple here. First one is from Juan Gomez, and he says, for the data processing, for example, vertical topographic difference, raster subtraction, and to align both data sets, did you use open source or commercial software?
We used, for the differencing itself, we used GDAL, which is open source, and we made no correction of the alignment.
Okay. The next question, I believe, is for Jason. I will ask a question relevant to your presentation, if that's all right, before we jump into a broader discussion. It was very clear that the point cloud density between the first survey and the second survey is very different in Indiana. Is that projected to continue, or are we hitting a limit in terms of point cloud density from airborne LiDAR? What is for Chelsea or for Jason?
That's more of a Jason question.
Okay.
And it's a great question, Tyler. Yeah, we just wrapped up this multi-year study we were doing called the 3D Nation study, which looked, I mentioned that 2012 study, which kind of set the stage for us knowing what kind of data to collect. The new study showed that the appetite for high resolution elevation data has just gone up. So people want higher resolution data and they want it more often. And they want it a lot of times, they want it at survey level accuracies, especially like for infrastructure folks. So once we have this once over, we have something called the next generation. And the target resolution that we're looking as kind of our floor there is the QL1, which is at least 8 points per square meter. But with like a lot of our projects, there's the ability to buy up. So if a state or local needs 20 points per square meter, if they want to pay for that upgrade, that's definitely a possibility. The other thing that we saw was that the repeat cycle, people need data, to do a lot of their things is around, the average is around 4 to 5 years, where before it was more like 6 to 10 in the original study. So we know that, one of the things we were trying to do is first get this once over baseline done for the US, get every pixel on the ground has a measurement. And so now we're starting to think about, and the work that Chelsea and others are doing is how do we apply our limited funds to do reacquisitions. Obviously we should probably spend the money where things have actually changed. And so we're working on, how do we make those decisions down the road to recollect data, especially at those higher resolutions to meet a lot of these needs.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's a question for Chelsea. Can we study sinkholes in urban areas with the same methodology? From Anfai Alenezi. Sorry if
I am not all that familiar with urban area sinkholes, but I imagine if you had topography data from both before and after the sinkholes formed, you could do this topographic differencing. I could see challenges in urban areas would be to over buildings. But if you had good recordings of the ground in the two data sets, then I imagine that the same methodology could apply.
Okay. We also had a question from James Mock. This one is for Jason, but he says both great presentations from both of you. He would, if there is, he would like you to, is there a contact information for the help desk, Jason, that you could briefly?
Yeah, and I chatted it, but for those that don't, I chatted it directly to the wrong person, but I'll re-chat it here to everybody. Okay. The email address is tnm_help@usgs.gov. Okay. So I'll chat that here so people can copy it and paste it real quick.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes.
Tyler, if possible, there was a question that Jason addressed in the chat, but for people who might later look at the recording, they won't have access to the chat. So maybe if that can also be mentioned live.
I believe you're referencing the one from Stephen Dijkstra earlier on about for Alaska, IFSAR vertical accuracy is stated to be very low, roughly 3 meters. Are there any plans to extend higher vertical accuracy observations or tools like 3D LiDAR to Alaska? Yeah,
and so I mentioned that study. That study showed that Alaska needs a lot higher resolution LiDAR data or elevation data than what IFSAR can provide. And so for the next generation, yes, we will be supporting at least QL2 acquisitions when partnership opportunities provide themselves up in Alaska. So hopefully in the next several years, you'll start seeing more LiDAR acquisitions under the 3D banner up there as well.
Okay, great. Are there, from Risa, Chelsea, is there a way to reconcile point clouds acquired at different scales?
So for this case, we grid both data sets to a 1 meter resolution. And this is about the limit of what the earlier data set can be gridded to and doesn't quite take advantage of all the possibilities of the later data sets. But it's still that 1 meter resolution is very useful for looking at this statewide change and already provided sufficiently large data sets. And so that 1 meter resolution was quite useful. And I don't think we were limited by the lower resolution of that second data set.
Chelsea, a question out of curiosity before we go, unless nobody else has any. Do you, on the whole, know if Indiana is going up or going down? Just across all environments?
That is a good question. I do not know.
No, you wouldn't be able to separate out construction and everything else, but
You mean from
if you just summed up. the
relational
total difference-
isostatic adjustment, for example?
Or, yeah, just, you could sum up the total differences, and is it going up or going down?
You could sum them up. You'd have to, at the state scale, you'd have to be very careful about those flight alignment errors,
Okay,
because I bet they would, because they're throughout the state, they may contaminate the whole, that average sign.
okay. I see we do have one more question here. I think if we have we'll just take the time to answer this one last question, and then we'll get out of here. This is from Stephen Dijkstra. For Chelsea, thanks for sharing. LiDAR has low temporal resolution compared to something like GNSS. How do you resolve this in your work?
So the key for using these different types of remote sensing technology is to appreciate that they're quite complementary to each other. And so, yes, LiDAR has this very low temporal resolution compared to GNSS, but it also has a much higher spatial resolution. And so the key is, to get what you can out of each data set. For example, looking at those buildings, new construction or sinkholes, being able to observe that variety of signal at that amplitude of change does require using topographic data.
Okay, well, we are a little past 9, so I want to thank both of our speakers, Dr. Chelsea Scott and Dr. Jason Stoker. Those were excellent presentations. I want to, before we go, mention that this will be recorded and will be available on the EPSP Connects YouTube page. So keep an eye out for that. And I also want to plug next month's event, April 19th, a session on ecology and geomorphology of wildfires with Dr. Clark Knight and Dr. Karina Sarovsky-Dariau. But for the moment, thank you both for an excellent event. And I hope you all can join us in the future.
Thank you, Tyler.
Thanks.